Virtue Ethics, From Tribalism to Socrates and Plato, Part 3. This presentation will be examining a number of issues, beginning, of course, with the question, how much influence did Plato exert on early Christianity and the Church? In addition, we'll be examining the Gospels and the early church history from around AD 35 to around 350 to 400 AD. In addition to Plato's thought, we also need to know some things about Augustine and Jerome, who lived in the late 300s, early 400s in Alexandria, Egypt. Within that context, we need to also understand a few other philosophical and religious methodologies and philosophies. Among these are the Persian religious perspective known as Manichaeism, the philosophical approach known as Gnosticism, and then finally, the rise of what came to be known as Neo-Platonism. First of all, some scholars, philosophers, for some reason, I know not why, tend to start the history of the early church with Augustine and Jerome around 400 AD in northern Africa. This is absolutely historically false and out of context, because Jesus lived in the 1st century AD, died, buried, rose from the dead by the mid-30s, 1st century AD. And the church immediately, within weeks, takes off, and in an explosive manner, the numbers dramatically increase from 2,000 to 4,000 more to thousands more. So by the time you reach the end of the 1st century, there are churches all over the known world at the time, from Italy and Rome to Greece to Anatolia and Turkey to Syria, Lebanon, to, of course, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, as well as moving eastward all the way into Afghanistan and India. Evidence also suggests that to the west, these inroads of early Christianity went as far as England, Scotland, and Ireland. Of course, with St. Brendan, St. Patrick, who date very early to the 400s. This was already going on in those regions. So there's a vast history of the early church that was long before the birth and the influence of Augustine and also that of Jerome. Is it true that Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and Neo-Platonism did have an impact and influence what happened in the church roughly from the 400s AD all the way down to the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s? The answer to that is certainly, it is true. But was this the defining of Christianity, or was it rather an alternative to the Orthodox view that was held by Christians and Jesus himself concerning who he was and his work from AD 35 to 400? The answer to that is absolutely not. And while the Protestant Reformation was not perfect in terms of everything that happened and its outcomes, it did provide this service to the faith. It returned the emphasis to the authority of God's Word and God Himself in relationship to each individual, and returned Christianity to a biblically orthodox perspective. So one of the things we'll be doing in this session is examining what happened, how it happened, and looking at those contrasts and conflicts that occurred between Orthodox Christianity, biblical Christianity, and what arose as the institutional church that became the center of the faith in Rome by around 900 AD. And of course, this eventually led to a great schism and split between the Roman Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. As a backdrop, I feel it's important to point out the nature of Christianity from its very inception. And the nature of Christianity was first and foremost not a religion. This is one of the great misunderstandings and misrepresentations of Christianity in the world today. It's one of the great religions. It isn't. It absolutely isn't. In fact, throughout the entire New Testament, which was written and completed and in circulation by the end of the first century AD, the word religion is only used once in the entire collection of documents in relation to Christianity. And that's in the book of James, and it's used as a point of contrast, where all of the religions around Christianity were saying what the right thing was and how to express the faith, which primarily was through works and rituals and sacrifices. Whereas Christianity, it was all about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and then the Golden Rule application in the world among the believers, but also extending to non-believers, to treat others as you would like to be treated, as God Himself would treat them, based on this idea that all humans, regardless of whether they are Christians or not, are created in the image of God, and therefore have intrinsic worth and value and should be given respect and dignity. The word religion itself comes from the Latin religare, which means to return to bondage. Ligare is the word we get ligaments and ligatures from, which are cords that bind and tie and hold things together. But in the sense of faith, it is a bondage, not a freedom. Again and again, Jesus in the Gospels and the writers of the New Testament talk about Christianity being liberating, re liberatio, freedom, liberation, and relatio, relationship. This is a huge distinction between Christianity and the other religions of the world. Christianity, in its truest form, derives from Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. He was, as he claimed himself to be, and his followers claimed, the fulfillment of all Old Testament prophecy concerning the Messiah who would come and redeem the people and save them from their sins and establish an eternal kingdom. In fact, Jesus is all over the Old Testament. His Hebrew name was Yeshua, and that name means Yahweh saves. Every time the word salvation or saves or saved is used in the Old Testament, the word is Yeshua, Jesus. So it was very clear even then that this one who would come, Yeshua, would be the Messiah, because he is the one Yahweh uses to save. This was a point of contention in the life of Jesus because it was given to Mary and Joseph to name him Yeshua, Jesus, for this precise purpose. And of course, the scholars at the time, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Zealots, these Jewish groups had trouble with this idea because Jesus, in some respects, didn't fit the expected mold. However, the Essenes, who lived in the wilderness, and most likely Jesus spent some time with them. In fact, he quotes from some of the writings from the Essenes. Most notably, he references the book of Isaiah, a passage there that's not in other versions of Isaiah, but also he references, as do James and Peter, the writings found in 1st Enoch. John the Baptist likely spent time with the Essenes as well. The early church called itself the Way, which is also what the Essenes called themselves. I find it interesting that the Essenes disappear very rapidly after the resurrection of Jesus and the rise of the early church in Jerusalem. My theory is that the Essenes were looking for the Messiah, and Jesus fit what they were looking for because they had the concept of a suffering Messiah, but also a triumphant king, as a twofold prophetic prediction about what the Messiah would be like and what he would do. So my theory is that they vanished because they were absorbed into the early church, and it was organic and natural for them to do so. And it is I think, more than a coincidence that the early church called itself the Way, and the Essenes prior to that time also identified themselves as the Way. The early church believed in God just as the Old Testament rabbis, scholars did, as a being who was not merely one being, but a being of multiple persons. They certainly believed in the idea of the transcendent Father, but also the immanent angel of the Lord, who always identifies not a mere angel, but a being, a divine being, who is God himself manifesting as a part of the Godhead in this world, while at the same time the Father God still remains existing in heaven. So right there you have this idea of God as at least two persons, and then when the Old Testament acknowledges and references the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of God, you have the third person of the Trinity there as well. And this is something that the early Christians believed immediately because it came out of their Jewish faith. And they saw in Jesus and in his teachings the clarity of this viewpoint. And Jesus does drive home this idea when he says, the Father and I are one. I am in the Father and he is in me. If you're in me, you'll be in the Father. And when I go to the Father, he will send to you his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, as a comforter who will be with you, and he will lead you into all truth. So again, the Spirit is identified by Jesus as not a force or something that emanates from the Father, is just a part of the Father, but a person in his own right. So you have the Trinity from the get-go as a very important doctrine that early Christianity was founded upon. Gnosticism enters the picture roughly around 150 AD and running down to around 350, 400 and further, but really prominent during those centuries. And Gnosticism was the viewpoint that really was a dichotomy or a dualism of the metaphysical reality and the physical reality. But Gnosticism had the view that mind and spirit were divine, pure, and perfect, and that the body was imperfect and corrupt. Therefore, the goal of Gnosticism, much like that of Hinduism and Buddhism, was to somehow gain the kind of enlightenment through whatever processes to escape this world of the physical and the physical body and to be absorbed into the divine perfection of the metaphysical reality. This stood in sharp contrast to the biblical view and the early Christian church view that the body was good, and God had created the body, the soul, the spirit, the mind, all as good, and there was no evil and sin in them as created originally. That the sin and corruption was something that occurred with the rebellion against God and his essence and nature that became a kind of an infection that was harmful to mind, body, soul, and spirit. Neo-Platonism has uncanny resemblances to Gnosticism. And of course, we must ask the question, which influenced which? And that's an impossible question to answer. But the fact remains that they shared in common some viewpoints concerning the metaphysical reality and the non-metaphysical or empirical reality. Manichaeism was a major 3rd century dualistic religion founded by the Persian prophet Mani, representing a cosmic struggle between the realms of light, which were good, and the realms of darkness, which were evil. It originated in the Sasanian Empire, blending elements of Zoroastrianism, elements of Christianity, and elements of Buddhism. The core beliefs included the idea that the material world is evil, with divine light trapped within it, requiring salvation through knowledge or gnosis and strict asceticism. It was an absolute dualism. The universe defined by two opposing forces, the kingdom of light, which they viewed as God, and the kingdom of darkness, which they viewed as Satan. The cosmic struggle was that Earth is a battlefield where light particles are imprisoned in matter. Salvation came through knowledge. It was achieved by releasing the trapped divine light particles within the soul through wisdom and ascetic pure living. Following its inception in the mid-3rd century, it spread rapidly, following the Silk Road all the way into China, but also going west into the Roman Empire. It survived for over 1,000 years and thrived in Central Asia and China until it faded around the 17th century. It influenced a number of religious movements, most notably Gnosticism, and was notably practiced by St. Augustine before his conversion to Christianity. Neo-Platonism dovetailed into Manichaeism and Gnosticism quite neatly. And this is because of Plato's dualistic view, where he describes a number of elements. Most notably, he describes 3 levels of reality. The one, which is not God, but is a sort of a divine all, similar to what you find in the monistic views of Hinduism and Buddhism. And the second level of reality is reason or rationalism. The third level is physical matter. Neo-Platonism was founded by Plotinus in the 3rd century AD, and it's a mystical philosophy centered on a hierarchy of reality emanating from a single supreme source called the One, or divine all. It teaches that all existence descends from a divine source, and souls which are divine in origin can return to it through purification. It also holds that everything that exists on the physical level is filled with the One in some respect. The goal is to return to the One and be absorbed into the divine all. This is exactly like Hinduism and Buddhism and what they say about liberation being moksha, or the release from this reality into the divine all, where the individual is absorbed into the divine all and disappears forever and experiences nirvana or bliss or non-being. This can be accomplished according to Neoplatonism through purification rites, virtue, and philosophical contemplation, thereby bypassing the allure and temptation of the physical world, the material world. The One is a supreme, indefinable source of all goodness and being from which everything else emanates. The emanation is a reality that is a hierarchy. The One, which is nous and intellect and mind, the soul, which is the world soul, and then finally, the third level, matter, which is the lowest level, the level which is a kind of bondage and captivity from which the true self and spirit must escape. The return to the One is the idea that one can turn away from the material body and ascend through these levels to reunite with the divine all. Evil is not a force, but is simply the privation or absence of goodness, which in this view becomes ignorance. So why is Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism important? Because these 3 philosophical and religious viewpoints heavily influenced Augustine of Hippo and Jerome. And Jerome especially because he was the primary translator of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, the Old and New Testament, into Latin, which, by the way, is the version that Augustine used to develop his theology and his teachings, because he could neither read or translate Hebrew or Greek himself. So he was absolutely reliant upon Jerome's translation, which in some respects was good, but in some other respects was flawed because he changed the actual meaning of what the text says in the original language to fit his own personal agenda, which Augustine happened to agree with. The result was that Christian theology was damaged and suffered for a period of centuries because it departed from the biblical Orthodox perspective and the authority of the Bible and became something else for a time. So, is it true that Manichaeism and Gnosticism and Neo-Platonism had an impact and an influence on Christianity in terms of the institutional church and the policies and the doctrines that were unbiblical that developed between around 400 AD all the way down to around 1500? The answer to that is absolutely. But thankfully, that was not the end of the story. The Protestant Reformation and the return to biblical authority and biblical orthodoxy was vital, and its impact was tremendous. Still, Jerome's translation and Augustine's promotion of doctrines that were extra biblical and frankly pagan and heretical became very important, and they had a tremendous impact. And unfortunately, it caused great harms and abuses through the institution of the church for a period of centuries. But what were Augustine's errors concerning the actual doctrines in the Bible? Well, one of them had to do with original sin and total depravity, which gave rise to the absolute authority of the Roman Church, but also, even in the Protestant Reformation, it further influenced doctrine through Jean Calvin and the rise of Calvinism as a theological approach. The problem is that it enthroned the sovereignty of God in the context of Calvinism to such a level that human beings lost the image of God and they lost free will, which the Bible very clearly supports both. In the Roman Church, it enthroned the church hierarchy and authority as being equal to, and sometimes even superior to, God Himself and God's Word. Well, Augustine promoted the idea based on Manichaeism and Gnosticism and Neoplatonism that there was something tragically and utterly corrupt and sinful about the human body. And because of this, the soul had also been corrupted and tainted, and human beings were totally depraved, totally evil. They could do no good in and of themselves, and if any good was done, it was God's grace acting in them and not them doing it. Therefore, the freedom of the will also suffered greatly. This is not a biblical position. The biblical position is that human beings are created in the image of God. They are created absolutely good and wonderful and remarkable. However, this disease of sin has had an effect in terms of corruption and perversion, and this is a struggle that human beings face. But they are a combination of absolute goodness with the struggle within and without against absolute evil. So the evil of the flesh was another problem Augustine had that was damaging to biblical Christianity. The body and physical experience was viewed as evil in and of itself, so it should therefore be subdued, eliminated in this life, hence a radical extreme kind of stoicism, and the goal was to escape that into a place or a reality that was purely spiritual and abstract. This is in part due to Augustine's own struggles. His father was pagan and celebrated his son's sexual escapades and adventures, while his mother was Christian and lamented that. Well, Augustine had numerous sexual escapades and adventures, and when he decided to embrace Christianity, this became a source of guilt, pangs in his conscience, and a feeling of shame and unworthiness. Well, I think he placed on all of humanity his own struggles and his own demons, much like Sigmund Freud did in the early 20th century with his theories of the ego, id, superego, and his Oedipus complex and Electra complex, where he proposed the idea that everything is driven by sexual impulse and desire, but on a subconscious level. So all little boys want to have sex with their mothers, and all little girls want to have sex with their fathers. And of course, this was something he struggled with himself, so he imposed it on everyone else, I think, to make himself feel more normal and better. How sad, and frankly, what a shame. For Augustine, this led to his doctrine of celibacy as the ideal. And of course, we can see how this affected the church in terms of the priesthood. It has been ironically observed that perhaps more illegitimate children were conceived and birthed due to the sexual escapades of priests because of celibacy than any other demographic in society at the time. Had Augustine allowed for sex and marriage as blessings from God and Orthodox biblical doctrines, a lot of that suffering and a lot of that evil would have most likely been avoided. Augustine also elevated Mary in a way to the status of being the Queen of Heaven. And the adoration of Mary began and then developed, and by the time you reach Bernard of Clairvaux, Mariolatry becomes a major element of the Roman Catholic Church, a major doctrine. It's ironic, however, to note that when you go back to the pagan religions and way back all the way to 10,000 BC, you have Inanna, the goddess of violence, sex, fertility, and gender, being identified as the Queen of Heaven. I think there's more to that than just a coincidence, perhaps, since Augustine was operating to a large extent from a pagan and mystical perspective. Well, having said all of this, the bottom line, I think, is this: we must be committed to historical and accurate information. And if we're not, we will arrive at conclusions that are absolutely false, and not only false, but damaging and sometimes quite dangerous. Let me give you an example from an actual historical event that has been propagated for now 1,500 years as a way of dismissing the validity of the Christian faith and attacking Christianity as the ultimate evil in the world. And this incident occurs in precisely the same time and place as we find Augustine and Jerome in North Africa, in Alexandria, in the late 300s, early 400s AD. And this narrative concerns the life of one Hypatia of Alexandria and her tragic death at the hands of a mob in which she was attacked and brutally killed. The modern pop culture version of Hypatia's story was promoted by Carl Sagan, famous for his Cosmos PBS television series. Carl Sagan was an atheist. He was no friend to Christianity, and his version of the story is somewhat strange, but the tale goes like this. Let me tell you about the end. It's a story about the last scientist to work in this place, a mathematician, astronomer, physicist, and head of the school of Neoplatonic philosophy in Alexandria. That's an extraordinary range of accomplishments for any individual in any age. Her name was Hypatia. She was born in this city in the year 370 AD. This was a time when women had essentially no options. They were considered property. Nevertheless, Hypatia was able to move freely, unself-consciously through traditional male domains. By all accounts, she was a great beauty, and although she had many suitors, she had no interest in marriage. The Alexandria of Hypatia's time, by then long under Roman rule, was a city in grave conflict. Slavery, the cancer of the ancient world, had sapped classical civilization of its vitality. The growing Christian church was consolidating its power and attempting to eradicate pagan influence and culture. Hypatia stood at the focus, at the epicenter of mighty social forces. Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, despised her, in part because of her close friendship with the Roman governor, but also because of what she symbolized. She was a symbol of learning and science, which were largely identified by the early church with paganism. In great personal danger, Hypatia continued to teach and publish until in the year 415 AD, on her way to work, she was set upon by a fanatical mob of Cyril's followers, and they dragged her from her chariot, tore off her clothing, and flayed her flesh from her bones with abalone shells. Her remains were burned, her works obliterated, her name forgotten, and Cyril was made a saint. End of quote. Well, this account is riddled with nonsense, as we will see. But it was the inspiration for a film by Amenabar, which essentially tells the same story. The film is titled Agora. And because of the popularity of the film, the story of Hypatia has been distorted and misrepresented and popularized to the level that most people take it as fact. Amenabar amplifies the tragedy of Hypatia's death by depicting her as discovering heliocentrism and Keplerian elliptical orbits. Despite this being a total invention by the screenwriters, publicity for the movie made it plausible. And Hypatia was identified as the person who came up with these concepts. New atheism has attached itself to Hypatia as a way of attacking Christianity as being intolerant. But like much new atheist bad history, the myths perpetuated and added to by Sagan and Amenabar can ultimately be traced back to Edward Gibbons, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. And his view is polemical and anti-Christian, as witnessed in the following quote. Hypatia, the daughter of Theon, the mathematician, was initiated in her father's studies. Her learned comments have elucidated the geometry of Apollonius and Diophantus, and she publicly taught, both at Athens and Alexandria, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. In the bloom of beauty and the maturity of wisdom, the modest maid refused her lovers and instructed her disciples. The persons most illustrious for their rank or merit were impatient to visit the female philosopher, and Cyril beheld with a jealous eye the gorgeous train of horses and slaves who crowded the door of her academy. A rumor was spread among the Christians that the daughter of Theon was the only obstacle to the reconciliation of the prefect and the archbishop, and that obstacle was speedily removed. On a fatal day in the holy season of Lent, Hypatia was torn from her chariot, stripped naked, dragged to the church, and inhumanly butchered at the hands of Peter the Reader and a troop of savage and merciless fanatics, which, in quote, were identified as monks. Her flesh was scraped from her bones with sharp oyster shells, and her quivering limbs were delivered to the flames. The just progress of inquiry and punishment was stopped by seasonable gifts, but the murder of Hypatia was imprinted as an indelible stain on the character and religion of Cyril of Alexandria. This is from Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. However, the narrative is a myth and not a historical fact. Gibbon goes on into detail about the illustrious later career of the wicked Bishop Cyril and his progress to sainthood, noting tartly, quote, superstition perhaps would more gently expiate the blood of a virgin than the banishment of a saint. The passage contains most of the key elements that have formed the hagiography of Hypatia as a martyr of science and learning, savagely murdered by ignorant Christian fanatics. Unsurprisingly, the Gibbonian narrative, boosted by Sagan and Agora, the film, is the mainstay of anti-theist folklore. The story gets repeated with little or no effort at checking how much of it is true. Key elements include Hypatia was a free thinker, skeptic, and probably an atheist who opposed religion. Hypatia was a significant scientist, astronomer, and mathematician. She was the inventor of the astrolabe and the hydroscope. She was the head of the school of Neo-Platonic philosophy in Alexandria. She was associated with the Great Library of Alexandria and even its last librarian. She was young and very beautiful. She was murdered out of hatred for her learning. Her death brought the intellectual tradition of Alexandria to an end and marks the end of classical civilization and the beginning of the Dark Ages. So, what is the truth? What are the historical facts? The main problem is that none of Hypatia's writings survive and no ancient source contains information about her that is reliable. In Rick Snedeker's The Faith in Facts blog, the following quote is used as a celebration of Hypatia and her martyrdom. And the quote reads, "Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myths, and miracles as poetic fancy. To teach superstitions as truths is a most terrible thing. The child mind accepts and believes them, and only through great pain and perhaps tragedy can he be in after years relieved of them." And this is a quote that's attributed to the viewpoint that Hypatia had concerning religion. Snedeker assures his readers that, quote, "Hypatia is important because many people erroneously think religious doubt, skepticism, and atheism are a mostly modern phenomena. Hypatia was, quote, the last secular philosopher of antiquity and a martyr in part of reason at the hands of religious zealotry." He goes on to endorse Gibbon's version of Hypatia's death. But where does the quote Snedeker uses come from? Well, the answer is that it was invented in 1908 by the American writer, soap salesman, and eccentric Elbert Hubbard in a series of educational books for children called Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great Teachers. Hubbard chose Hypatia as one of his, quote, great teachers, but he was stymied by the awkward fact that we actually have none of Hypatia's writings or teaching. That makes it rather hard to present her as a great teacher. He solved the problem by simply making some teachings up, including the wise words of Snedeker's quote. Of course, the real Hypatia was very different to the mythic version beloved by the current crop of secularists and new atheists. For 700 years, a Greek-speaking elite ruled Alexandria. This type of elite ruled over the largest cities of the Roman world. Somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people crammed into the 10 square miles that constituted Alexandria. We know Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, who was a philosopher and mathematician. Theon was also somewhat of an occultist who was known for looking for signs through the examination of birds and the croaking of ravens. The examination of birds had to do with dissecting and looking at entrails for omens. But none of the skeptics and atheists who hold him up as a source of her alleged rationalism and skepticism seem aware of his occultism. It is likely that Hypatia was a brilliant student and that she received education from her father, and there are some resources, like the 10th century AD Byzantine Encyclopedia, which talks about her scholarly works, all of which, of course, have been lost, so we don't have those to look at. However, the grandiose claims that have been made concerning her invention of scientific instruments is absurd. The idea that Hypatia invented the plain astrolabe and the graduated brass hydrometer and the hydroscope is ridiculous. It's complete nonsense. To begin with, astrolabes predated Hypatia's time by at least 500 years. We have surviving letters by one of Hypatia's students, Synesius, that mentions her in connection with an astrolabe, but it does not claim that she invented anything. Even more ridiculous and absurd is the depiction from the movie Agora of Hypatia as a radical innovator in astronomy who rejected geocentrism, embraced a heliocentric cosmology, and even discovered the planets to have elliptical orbit. This is nothing but total fantasy. Hypatia may have been an excellent scholar and renowned for learning, but she was not a great innovator and she did not invent anything that we know of. But what about the claim that Cyril stirred up a group of monks who became unruly and riotous, and they murdered Hypatia by flaying her skin from her bones? Well, first of all, the story has a number of flaws. One, Hypatia was not a young woman at the time, she was old. Two, monks did not kill Hypatia, nor did the clergy. Alexandrians led by a lector named Peter did it. Peter the lector is a reader in the church, but he was a layperson. The mob of monks that are referenced were around several years before this scene in 419 AD, and they actually rescued Christians from death at the hands of Alexandrian Jews, which, by the way, as many as 90,000 Christians were martyred during that era. Cyril, third, did not instigate the mob against Hypatia, nor was he there when they killed her. Now, these facts are not meant to diminish Hypatia's integrity as a person and the tragedy of her death at the hands of radicals. It appears she was a highly respected teacher of Neo-Platonism. She was a friend of Orestes, the prefect or governor of Alexandria in Egypt, and Orestes seemed to be fond of Hypatia. But she did influence him towards neo-pagan beliefs. This was a very violent time in history. Lots of riots. Cyril and Orestes had a falling out because Cyril had a mob of monks come and drive the Jews out of Alexandria to protect Christians from being martyred. Many Christians at that time believed that Hypatia prevented a reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. One of the primary sources for the death of Hypatia is an individual named Socrates Scholasticus. And in his version, he talks about a mob led by a lector named Peter who dragged Hypatia to a church and tore her flesh with potsherds till she died. This brought great disgrace, says Socrates, on the Church of Alexandria and on its bishop, Cyril. But Peter, the lector at Alexandria, was not a cleric, was not a priest. Hypatia died during the riot, and this is true. But the statement that Cyril was responsible is a different matter. Socrates, who was no friend of Cyril, did not lay the blame on Cyril. Cyril was not even there, according to him. Damascius, indeed, accuses Cyril, but he's a late authority and a hater of Christians. How much later? A few hundred years. It's a mistake to quote the writings of an anti-Christian like Damascius rather than a man of integrity and respect like Socrates. The logic is dubious. Cyril was a great influence on the direction of Christianity. He was responsible for defending the dogma of the Trinity against Nestorius, who just about won out when trying to convince the church that the human and divine nature of Jesus were separate. Basically, Nestorius would have turned Christ's sacrifice on the cross into nothing but another death of a prophet and would have turned Christianity into a New Age fallacy. But Cyril stood up against it. And without Cyril, it's questionable whether the doctrine of the Trinity would have stood as a biblical doctrine as it should have. Well, it is certainly a shame and a tragedy that a woman like Hypatia, regardless of her philosophy and her religious views, would be attacked and murdered in the fashion that she was. There is no excuse for this. But we need to be true to the historical facts, and if monks in fact did not do it, and Cyril opposed it, which, by the way, there is evidence that Cyril was the kind of moral person that had he been there at the time, he would have intervened and tried to stop it and prevent it, regardless of his disagreements with Hypatia. But the point is, we must accept what the facts say and let them speak for themselves. Today, Hypatia has been immortalized and romanticized, but in doing so, we have lost the truth of the history and promoted a myth and a fantasy. This is easily demonstrated by looking at some of the art celebrating Hypatia down through history. She always seems to be depicted as a vibrant, vivacious young woman, very appealing physically. Some of the art even depicts her as a nude who is voluptuous and enchanting. Well, my final word to you here is that we need to hold ourselves to a high standard concerning history, concerning authority, concerning what manuscripts actually say and what can be accepted as valid and legitimate. Now, this session has been a little longer than some, but there was a lot of material that I had to cover, and I felt I needed to make you aware of what the facts are concerning some of these issues. I would like to close, though, on a positive note with a couple of pieces of music again that stand in the tradition of tribalism and the tradition of Socrates and Plato and the tradition of the early church. One of these pieces is a composition that I did. It's called Heart of the Lion, and it incorporates the rhythms and the style of some African and Western musical elements together, but it also uses both English and Swahili, the African language Swahili, in it to make its presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you like it. The other piece is composed by the great Canadian singer-songwriter, most celebrated musical artist in Canadian history, Gordon Lightfoot, and it's a Native American piece he wrote that tells a legend or a story about a little boy, and it's called Cherokee Bend. And I hope you enjoy both of those, and then you just have a wonderful day for the rest of your day. Remember what I like to say, stay safe and be kind.
His father was a man who could never understand the shame on a red man's face. So they lived in the hills and they never came down but to trade in the white man's place. Early in the spring when the snow had disappeared, they came down with a bag of skins. In the fall of the year of 1910, Daddy died by the road down in Cherokee Bend. Daddy didn't like what the white man said about the dirty little kid at his side. Daddy didn't like what the white man did, nor the deal or the way that he lied. There was blood on the floor of the government store when the men took his daddy away. And the boy stayed by till he come to his end, and he run like the wind from Cherokee Bend. Now the mother was alone and the winter was at hand, and she prayed to her spirit can. It was warm in the lodge in the Kentucky hills on the day when the boy came in. Then a blizzard came down and it covered up the door till they thought that it never would end. And he told her the tale of the terrible affair in the government store down in Cherokee Bend. Daddy didn't like what the white man said about the dirty little kid at his side. Daddy didn't like what the white man did, nor the deal or the way that he lied. For 3 long days and 3 long nights, they wept and they mourned, and then she returned to her work in her weaving, and they tried to forget about Cherokee Bend. Now the boy wasn't big, but he hunted what he could, and they lived for a time that way. But the food ran low and the meat went bad, and she said to the boy one day, I'm leaving tonight and I never will return from the land of my spirit ken. You must take what you need and trade what you can for a red man's grave down in Cherokee Bend. It wasn't very long till she closed her eyes and he wrapped her in a robe. He found her a place on the side of the hill and he buried her in the snow. Early Early in the spring he was seen coming down with his load looking ragged and thin. Not a year had gone by when he stood once again in the government store down in Cherokee Bend. He was 10 years tall and a redskin too, so he hadn't much face to save. And the men sat around and they laughed and they clowned at the talk of a criminal's grave. And a man from the east didn't smile when he said, "You're the son of that Indian scum. If you value your hide, then you better abide by the white man's rules here in Cherokee Bend." But Daddy didn't like what the white man said about the dirty little kid at his side. Daddy didn't like what the white man did, nor the deal or the way that he lied. Then he spit on the floor of the government store, and it served him to no good end. At the close of the day, they had taken him away to the white man's school down in Cherokee Bend. It's been 21 years since the boy disappeared. Where he run to, nobody knows. But they say he fell in with a man named Jim, and he rides in the rodeo. They say he returned all alone to a place hidden deep in the Kentucky clan. And it's pretty well known who hauled up the stone to the grave on the hill above Cherokee Bay. Daddy didn't like what the white man said about the dirty little kid at his side. Daddy didn't like what the white man did, nor the deal or the way that he lied. There was blood on the floor of the government store when the men took his daddy away. It was 1910 and they never had a friend when he died by the rope down in Cherokee Bay. It was 1910 and they never had a friend when he died by the rope down in Cherokee Bay.
Every girl is a thing of beauty, every boy is a hero's song, a perfect blend of love and duty, tenderness and toughness strong. In a world of strange behaviors, in a troubled, twisted time, too many thieves and cardboard saviors traffic in sin but deny their crime. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, I'm searching for the sacred stone. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, for something certain in the great unknown. The spirit wind in the grass is calling, the restless sound in the rustling leaves, glowing eyes where the night is falling, a tapestry Lord Mungo weaves. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, I'm searching for the sacred stone. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, for something certain in the great unknown. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, I'm searching for the sacred stone. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, for something certain in the great unknown. Every woman is a thing of beauty, every man is a hero's song, a perfect blend of love and beauty, tenderness and toughness strong. I'm looking for the heart of the lion, Jesus Christ. I'm searching for the sacred stone,
I'm looking for the heart of the lion. I'm searching for the sacred stone. I'm looking for the heart of the lion. I'm searching for the sacred stone. There's something certain in the great unknown. I'm looking for the heart of the lion. I'm looking for the heart of the lion.